Have you ever been faced with the uncomfortable job of explaining to someone why it is that you or someone you love or just people in general stay in relationships with somebody engaged in intimate terrorism? Well, if so, this video is for you, but we're going to flip the script. We're going to suggest to the folks that are asking those questions, if you understood the dynamics and you understood the brain, you'd stay too. Hello again. My name is Chris Wilson, the director of Being Trauma Informed, and our last video in this series of 4 in honor of Domestic Violence Awareness Month is going to take you through a number of reasons that suggest why you'd stay too if you were in a relationship with somebody engaged in intimate terrorism. So, the first reason is this. As we've talked about in the previous 3 videos, the abuse, or as I like to call it, the organizing, can be so subtle that it is not thought about as abuse. In other words, I've had several clients on my caseload in the past when I had a clinical practice who were there because they came to a training I did that described these dynamics. And when they heard about organizing and they heard about how the brain generalizes, they said, "Oh my gosh, you're describing my marriage or my relationship. I never thought of myself as being abused, but I've been anxious and I suffer from nightmares and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." So if the abuse was so subtle that you didn't get that it was abuse and you didn't think of yourself as a victim, you'd stay too. I guarantee it. The second factor is this notion that because very often the abuse is subtle, and an issue that we didn't talk about is that there's all this research that suggests that the majority of folks engaged in intimate terrorism are only abusive in the context of their intimate relationship. So they're not abusive with people at work, they're not abusive with other family and friends. And so I want you to think about, with that abuse being subtle, with folks not seeing it, what happens? How is a victim organized by family and friends when they finally step forward and decide to disclose? I would suggest to you that way too often, the way folks are treated is along the lines of victim blaming. This notion of, for example, as a client shared with me one time, "Are you sure we're talking about the same person?" Meaning she had disclosed to her best friend that her husband of 15 years had been psychologically and verbally abusive for the duration of their relationship. And her best friend said, "Are you sure we're talking about the same person?" Meaning, that's not how I experience your husband. How could you possibly experience him that way? It doesn't make any sense. What I would suggest to you is that family and friends very often organize victims from the perspective of not wanting to hear the truth. They don't want to really know what's going on in the relationship. They just want to maintain the notion of harmony. They want to maintain the notion that everything's fine, because think about how challenging it is to find out that your in-law, that your brother-in-law, your son-in-law, your daughter-in-law, etc., has been engaging in psychological, verbal, physical, financial, whatever, abuse. It's challenging. Not to say that that excuses them, but safe to say many, many victims are organized by family and friends to doubt themselves. And unfortunately, what the brain does is the brain fills in the blanks. So if I show you a square with only the corners filled in, your brain still sees a square. And we do the same thing with meaning. If I suggest to you that your partner isn't nearly as abusive as you say they are, and in fact, they're not abusive at all, then we will have a tendency to fill in the blanks with, well, maybe it's my fault. Maybe I'm the one who's causing the problem. Folks, if that was your situation, if when you disclosed, you started to feel like you were the problem and not your intimate partner, then yeah, you would stay too. The third factor at play here is that, as a colleague of mine likes to say, when judges marry folks, they don't say until divorce do you part, right? It's until death do you part. People don't enter relationships, not just marriages, but people don't enter relationships with the goal of ending them. The whole notion is to find somebody that you can spend time with, that you can build a relationship with, the whole notion of the love of your life. Well, what that does is at the outset, it builds what we call neural networks of attachment. And folks, this is really important to understand. Attachment is a survival mechanism. Attachment was absolutely necessary 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago. And our brains have not changed a whole lot in 10, 20, 50,000 years. So that drive to attach is still a part of us from a survival perspective. So when you begin the relationship, you build these networks of attachment. You build positive memories. You build positive experiences. You build hope. And that's why you so often hear survivors or victims say things like, no, you don't understand. They're not like that all the time. Or you don't understand. They're trying to change. They said they would go to therapy. This is about attachment. This is about something called cognitive dissonance, that when we've built this network of attachment, when we've built this relationship with someone, it becomes extremely challenging to see that person as abusive. And so if you were faced with this dilemma of either saying to yourself, I chose someone abusive, or saying they're trying to change, they're not abusive all the time, you'd go with the more pleasing thought, the notion of this person's trying to change, the notion of, hey, it's not that bad. And if that's the direction you went, and that's the direction many, many human beings go, well, you'd stay too. Because at the end of the day, this is all leading to, if I leave, then I'm the one who's abandoning this relationship. And that's not acceptable. That's not okay. The fourth factor is related to something called neuroception. And this is a fancy term, but it's very simple. It's your brain's ability to appraise the environment regarding safety or threat. So it starts out with your brain's ability to map the environment to safety or threat. And then it has to do with your brain's ability, if your brain maps an environment to threat, to become subcortically, meaning beyond your awareness, you just become more aware of that environment. Take the example of walking down a well-lit street in the middle of the night. You're by yourself, and one of those street lights goes out right over your head, and suddenly you're surrounded in darkness. Your brain, if it had been mapping that environment to safety, now maps that environment to threat, and you feel it in your gut. It doesn't necessarily mean that threat is present. It just means that the chance of there being threat in the environment has gone up. You are on more alert. You're more what we call vigilant. Well, victims of intimate terrorism will tell you that system for them is hypersensitive. So what this means is victims of intimate terrorism feel in their gut the danger that comes with even thinking about trying to leave. Now, the research backs this up 100%. The research says the most dangerous time for a victim of intimate terrorism, when they are under the most potential for threat, is either in trying to leave or when they have just left in the days and months after. So the research supports this neuroceptive gut feeling that I am actually safer if I stay than if I leave. And if you felt that in your gut, if you knew that to your core, that it was safer if you stayed, yeah, you would stay too. The last factor is the notion that, yes, as you have hopefully already learned, there are incredible practical challenges that victims of intimate terrorism face. Very often, you don't have things in your own name. For example, bank accounts in your own name. The mortgage isn't in your name. You don't have a credit history. Very often, you've been isolated from family and friends. So there are all these practical hurdles. Well, in addition to the practical hurdles, I want you to take into account the impact of stress and threat on the brain, because what it does is it has a tendency to make it challenging to engage the region of our brain that plays such a large role in planning and logical thinking. It's called the prefrontal cortex. And so the impairment of this prefrontal cortex is why you have likely heard from somebody just the thought of filling out a loan application is totally overwhelming. I can't even imagine how I could do that. Well, the reality is it's a process of filling out a loan application, and you look up the answers if you don't have them yourself. But if your prefrontal cortex is impaired, that feels absolutely overwhelming. So compare the last factor, that notion of the fear that you experience when even thinking about leaving, with the fact that planning to leave can be experienced as completely overwhelming because you don't have access to this prefrontal cortex, this region of the brain that is so helpful in allowing you to break things down and look at big problems from the perspective of small pieces, right? If that region of your brain was struggling and you faced all of those challenges, you would see them as totally overwhelming in the same way that so many victims and survivors do. And if that was the case, yes, you'd stay too. Now, we can't cover everything in one short video, so there are other reasons why people stay. Every case is its own, and it's impossible to generalize, but safe to say, I hope that the video that you've watched today has shed some light on the integration of the science and the practicalities of why it is that if you were facing the same scenario, you'd stay too. So that wraps up our 4-part learning series in honor of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And I hope that you've noticed we've upgraded our audio and video for this last video, and we'll be using this setup moving forward. So if you have suggestions for future topics, please feel free to email us, info@beingti.com. Again, my name's Chris Wilson, the director of Being Trauma Informed, and we'll see you next week on the Being Trauma Informed video learning series.